18 RAF Mosquito bombers attacked a French prison in broad daylight in 1944 to free 700 French resistance members. But here's what nobody tells you. Nobody knows who actually ordered the mission. Nobody knows why it was really done. And the truth is way more complicated and way darker than the official story suggests. When you hear about World War II bombing raids, you probably think of massive fleets of aircraft dropping tons of bombs on cities and factories, strategic bombing campaigns that lasted for hours, hundreds of planes, thousands of tons of explosives, total destruction. But Operation Jericho was different. Operation Jericho was precise. Operation Jericho was surgical. 18 bombers, one prison, one mission. Get in, drop the bombs, get out. That's it. A medical strike on a military target. Except the target wasn't military. It was a prison full of civilians. And French civilians at that. Our allies. But here's the problem with this story. Everything about it is a mystery. Who ordered it? The official records are unclear. The paperwork disappeared or was destroyed. Historians have been arguing about it for 80 years. Why was it ordered? What was the real objective? Was it to free the prisoners? Was it something else? Political motives? Strategic advantage? Nobody knows for certain. And what actually happened? The chaos, the tragedy, the success, the failure. It's all been disputed since the day it happened. Survivors tell different stories. Military records contradict each other. The French resistance and the RAF have different versions of events. So what really went down on that February day in 1944? Let's talk about the truth that the military has been hiding. To understand Operation Jericho, we need to understand what was happening in France in 1944. The German occupation had been brutal. It had lasted for 4 years. The Nazis had killed thousands of French civilians. They had executed resistance fighters. They had imprisoned anyone who opposed them. But by early 1944, something was changing. The Germans knew the Allies were coming. They knew the invasion was coming. They knew their days in France were numbered. So they started preparing for the end. They started consolidating power. They started eliminating threats. The French resistance had become a serious problem for the Nazis. These weren't just random saboteurs. These were organized cells working together. They had safe houses. They had weapons caches. They had intelligence networks. They were helping Allied pilots escape. They were gathering intelligence on German positions. They were planning for the day when the Allies would invade. And the Nazis wanted to crush them before that day came. Amiens Prison was a fortress. It was built like a medieval castle in the middle of a French city. High walls, deep dungeons, thick stone. The Nazis had turned it into one of their most important detention facilities. They held over 2,000 prisoners there. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, people the Nazis wanted to keep contained and secure. And among those prisoners were approximately 700 members of the French resistance. 700 trained fighters who knew how to sabotage, how to fight, how to cause problems for the occupation. These weren't ordinary prisoners. These were men who had been fighting back against the Nazi occupation. They had been sabotaging German operations. They had been helping Allied soldiers escape. They had been gathering intelligence. They had been organizing uprisings. And the Nazis wanted to make examples of them. The plan was execution. Mass execution. The Nazis were going to execute 700 French resistance fighters as a deterrent, as a message, as revenge. It was going to be a massacre. 700 men dead, all on the same day, all at the same location. The whole operation was scheduled for early February 1944. The executions were going to happen. It was just a matter of time. But someone in the Allied command structure decided that something had to be done. Someone decided that these men couldn't be allowed to die. Someone decided that 700 trained resistance fighters were too valuable to lose. Someone authorized a bombing raid on a prison in the middle of a French city occupied by the Nazis. A mission that would be incredibly dangerous. A mission that would likely kill some of the prisoners they were trying to save. A mission that made no conventional military sense. The problem is, we don't know who that someone was. The official records say the mission was requested by the French resistance. The French wanted the prison bombed. They wanted the walls destroyed so prisoners could escape. They gave coordinates. They gave timing. They said, this is our problem and we need help. But other historians argue that's not the whole story. Other historians think there were political reasons, strategic reasons, reasons that have never been fully explained, reasons that may have been deliberately hidden. One theory suggests that the mission was ordered by someone high up in the RAF who wanted to prove that precision bombing was possible. The RAF had been taking criticism for their bombing campaigns. They were being criticized for killing too many civilians. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden had been flattened. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were dead. The American bombing campaign was also killing civilians. Strategic bombing was controversial. It was brutal. It was effective militarily, but it was also devastating to civilian populations. Someone in the RAF wanted to show that precision bombing was possible. They wanted to show that you could target a specific building without destroying everything around it. So they chose Amiens Prison as the target. It was a perfect test case. Bomb the prison walls. Free the prisoners. Minimal civilian casualties. Proof that precision bombing worked. But there's a problem with this theory. If this was just a test of precision bombing, why not just destroy the walls? Why coordinate with the resistance? Why time it so prisoners could escape? Why involve so many people in the operation? If it was just a bombing test, it would be simpler, cleaner, less controversial. But this operation was anything but simple or clean. It was complicated. It was coordinated. It involved multiple military branches. It involved political considerations. It involved timing and planning that suggested there was more to it than just proving a bombing technique. Another theory suggests that the mission was ordered because the French resistance was planning something big. Maybe they were planning a major uprising. Maybe they were planning coordinated sabotage operations that required freeing 700 fighters. Maybe someone wanted to help them succeed. Or maybe someone wanted to disrupt their plans by freeing prisoners early, before the planned uprising. The truth is lost to history. The records don't exist, or if they do exist, they're still classified. 80 years after the war, and some documents are still secret. What we do know is that the mission was planned in secret. Even the pilots didn't know what they were actually bombing until hours before takeoff. They were given orders. They were told they were going to bomb a German target. They were told it was important. They were told to be precise. They were told to fly low and fast to avoid anti-aircraft fire. They were told to hit the target and get out. But they weren't told it was a prison. They weren't told there were 2,000 civilians inside. They weren't told they might be killing French prisoners they were supposedly trying to save. They weren't told any of this until they were about to get in their aircraft. When the pilots found out what the target actually was, some of them objected. They said bombing a prison was wrong. They said it violated the rules of war. They said killing civilians was not acceptable. But they were told this was an order. This came from high command. This was authorized by military leadership. This was important to the war effort. They were told to follow orders or face court-martial. They were told this was necessary, so they prepared their aircraft. They loaded their bombs. They got ready to fly. The operation was led by Wing Commander Percy Pickard. Pickard was a legendary RAF pilot. He was one of the best pilots in the entire Air Force. He had flown dozens of dangerous missions. He had been shot down. He had been captured. He had escaped. He had survived things that killed other men. He was brave, skilled, respected, and reliable. He was the kind of pilot you wanted leading a dangerous, controversial operation because he could do it. He could execute the mission cleanly. He could minimize casualties. He could pull it off. Pickard was born in 1915. He was a career RAF officer. He had been flying since the 1930s. He had flown Spitfires early in the war. He had been involved in experimental aircraft testing. He was known for his skill and his judgment. He was known for thinking about his pilot's safety. He was known for getting the job done without unnecessary losses. So when this operation needed a leader, Pickard was chosen. But Pickard understood what he was being asked to do. He understood the risks. He understood the potential for things to go wrong. And he also understood that this might be his last mission. He had already flown so many. He had already beaten the odds so many times. He had already come back from things that should have killed him. Pickard had a wife. He had a family. He knew that every mission could be the one that didn't come back. And this mission felt different to him. This mission felt dangerous in a way that went beyond the normal risks of combat flying. On February 18, 1944, 18 Mosquito bombers prepared for takeoff. These were fast, nimble aircraft. They could fly low and fast. They could evade German fighters. They could dodge anti-aircraft fire. The plan was to fly low across France, approach the prison at treetop level, drop their bombs precisely on the prison walls, and escape before German fighters could react. It was a bold plan. It was dangerous, but the RAF had practiced precision bombing. They knew they could do it. The Mosquitoes were divided into 3 groups. The first group would bomb the north wall of the prison. The second group would bomb the south wall. The third group would bomb the guards' quarters and administrative buildings. The idea was to create escape routes on multiple sides of the prison so prisoners would have options, so they wouldn't all be funneled into one area where they could be recaptured. so the resistance could help as many people escape as possible. The bombers took off in waves. They flew low across the English Channel. They flew low across occupied France. They were flying at maybe 500 miles per hour, at altitudes of maybe 100 feet above the ground. They were moving fast enough that German radar couldn't track them properly. They were flying low enough that anti-aircraft gunners had trouble getting a clear shot. The plan was working so far. The bombing run was timed perfectly. The RAF had coordinated with the French resistance. The resistance would be ready. They had people inside the prison. They had people outside the prison. As soon as the walls came down, as soon as the escape routes were open, the prisoners would run. They would flee into the streets of Amiens. They would disappear into the city. The Nazis wouldn't be able to stop them all. The bombers approached the target at dawn. They came in low, very low, so low that civilians in the city could see them. So low that anti-aircraft gunners had trouble getting a clear shot. The pilots were flying at maybe 100 feet above the ground. They were flying fast. They were flying with precision. They could see the prison. They could see the walls. They could see the guards. The first wave of bombers hit the prison walls. The bombs were specially designed. They were meant to blast through the thick stone walls without destroying the entire building. The idea was to create escape routes without killing everyone inside. It was a delicate balance. Too much explosive force and the whole building would collapse, killing prisoners inside. Too little, and the walls wouldn't come down, and everyone would be trapped inside with no way out. The bombs hit. The prison exploded. Sections of the prison wall came crashing down, huge sections. The devastation was immediate. Massive holes appeared in the fortress walls. The outer walls were breached. The way was open. Prisoners could escape. The bombing was more successful than anyone expected. The walls came down. The escape routes opened. Everything was working, but the bombing also killed people. Some prisoners were killed by the bombs. Some guards were killed. Some civilians in the surrounding area were killed. Nobody knows the exact number. Estimates range from over 100 to several hundred. The official count says 102 people died in the bombing. But historians argue that number is too low. They think it was probably higher. Maybe 150, maybe 200. The confusion was so great that nobody really knows. And here's where it gets even more complicated. The bombing was so successful that it actually trapped some of the prisoners inside. The explosions caused damage. The walls came down. But the internal structure was damaged too. Some corridors were blocked. Some cells were destroyed. Some prisoners who tried to escape found their way blocked by rubble. They couldn't get out. They were trapped inside by the very bombs that were supposed to free them. Some of the prisoners didn't even know what was happening. When the bombs started falling, they thought it was a German attack. They thought they were being bombed by the Allies. They thought they were about to die. Some hid in their cells. Some tried to break out of their cells. Some tried to dig their way out of rubble. Some panicked. The chaos was total. The confusion was absolute. Prisoners were running in all directions. Some were running toward the exits. Some were running away from the explosions. Some were running toward the guards trying to help them. The guards inside the prison didn't know what to do. Some tried to maintain order. Some tried to prevent escapes. Some ran away themselves. Some were killed by the bombing. Some were injured. The command structure broke down. There was no clear authority. There was no clear plan for what to do after the bombing. The Germans had contingencies for riots, for uprisings, for escapes. But they didn't have a contingency for their prison being bombed by RAF aircraft. That was not something they had planned for. But despite the confusion, despite the danger, despite the fact that some prisoners didn't know what was happening, many managed to escape. The official count says 258 prisoners escaped, but other estimates put the number higher. Some say as many as 300 escaped. Some say fewer. Nobody knows for certain because the chaos made it impossible to count accurately. The RAF had no way to count escapes. The resistance was busy helping people escape. The Germans were trying to restore order. Nobody was keeping careful records of who got out. The escaped prisoners ran through the streets of Amiens. They scattered. Some were caught by Germans immediately. They were recaptured within minutes of escaping. Some were picked up by the French resistance who had organized safe houses, hiding places, escape routes. Some just disappeared into the civilian population and went home. Many of them would go on to continue fighting the Nazis. They would rejoin the resistance. They would help liberate France. They would fight from the day they escaped all the way to the end of the war in Europe. But the mission came at a cost. As I said, the official count says 102 people died in the bombing. But that includes prisoners and civilians. It includes guards. The exact breakdown is unclear. How many prisoners died? How many guards? How many civilians? Nobody really knows. The records are incomplete. Some bodies were never identified. Some people disappeared. Some were counted twice. The chaos made accurate accounting impossible. The RAF lost 2 aircraft. 2 Mosquitoes were shot down by German fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Both aircraft crashed in France, and one of them was piloted by Wing Commander Pickard, the legendary RAF pilot, the man who led the operation. He was killed in the mission. His aircraft was shot down over France. Pickard and his navigator died in the crash. They died trying to free the prisoners. They died on the way out after the bombing was complete. After the bombing, there was confusion. There was debate. There was controversy. The official RAF statement said the mission was a success. The walls were breached. The prisoners escaped. The resistance was strengthened. But other people questioned whether it was worth the cost. Over 100 people died, including prisoners and civilians, for 258 prisoners freed. That's not a good ratio by military standards. 102 dead to save 258? That's questionable. That's morally ambiguous. And then there's the mystery of who ordered it. The official story changed over time. First they said the RAF decided to do it on their own initiative. Then they said the French resistance requested it. Then they said it was a joint decision by RAF and the resistance. Then different people claimed different things. But the records are unclear. The people involved have died. The original orders have disappeared or been destroyed. 80 years later, we still don't know for certain who made the final decision to bomb that prison. Some historians think it was ordered by someone trying to protect French resistance operations. They think someone high up in the military wanted to prevent the execution of 700 fighters who were going to be essential to the liberation of France. The Allies were planning the invasion of France. They were planning D-Day. They knew they would need resistance fighters on the ground to help. They knew they would need sabotage operations. They knew they would need intelligence gathering. 700 trained resistance fighters were too valuable to lose. So someone authorized a dangerous, controversial mission to save them. Other historians think it was ordered for different reasons. They think someone wanted to prove that precision bombing was possible. They think someone wanted to score a propaganda victory. They think someone wanted to help the French resistance carry out operations that would destabilize the Nazi occupation. They think someone wanted to demonstrate RAF capability to the Americans. They think someone wanted to prove that the RAF could do precision bombing like the Americans claimed they could do. Whatever the real reason, the official explanation doesn't fully explain it. The mystery deepened after the war. When historians started investigating, they found that many records were missing. Many files had been destroyed. Many documents were classified. Even decades later, some documents related to Operation Jericho were still classified. Why would documents about a 70-year-old bombing raid still be secret? What was so sensitive about this operation that it had to remain classified for decades? That suggested there was something more to the story. That suggested there were reasons for the operation that hadn't been publicly disclosed. Wing Commander Pickard became a legend after his death. He was celebrated as a hero. He was remembered as the pilot who led the daring raid. His sacrifice was honored. But Pickard was also just a man following orders that came from someone who had reasons for authorizing the mission, someone whose name might not even be in the historical record, someone who made a decision in a secure room, in a military headquarters, that resulted in Wing Commander Pickard's death. What we do know is that the mission had consequences that nobody anticipated. Yes, prisoners escaped. Yes, the walls were breached. Yes, the resistance was strengthened. But the prison was damaged. Some prisoners died. Civilians died. RAF pilots died. The British military had authorized a bombing raid on a prison in a French city occupied by the Nazis. If something had gone wrong, if more civilians had been killed, if the publicity had been bad, if the operation had been discovered before it happened, the whole thing could have been a disaster. The German response was interesting. The Nazis found out about the bombing quickly. They investigated. They blamed it on the RAF. They blamed it on the French resistance. They executed some of the prisoners who hadn't escaped. They arrested people suspected of helping the prisoners, but they didn't seem to fully understand the scope of the operation. They didn't seem to realize that this had been a coordinated military operation. They treated it more like a bombing accident than a deliberate military strike. But it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. It was planned. It was coordinated. It was authorized by military command. And it succeeded. The prisoners escaped. The resistance was strengthened. The walls came down. And the mission became a legend. A daring raid, brave pilots, a successful operation. That's how it's remembered in the official history. But if you dig deeper, if you look at the records, if you talk to historians, if you examine the evidence that does exist, the story becomes murkier. The costs become higher. The justification becomes less clear. The mystery deepens. Nobody knows who ordered it. Nobody knows why it was really done. And nobody knows if it was actually worth the lives it cost. After the war, the survivors told their stories. Prisoners who escaped wrote memoirs. They talked about the confusion. They talked about the danger. They talked about the moment the walls came down. They talked about running through the streets trying to escape. Their stories all matched. They all confirmed that the bombing happened. They all confirmed that many people escaped. They all confirmed that there was chaos and danger. The RAF pilots who survived talked about their missions. They talked about flying low across France. They talked about seeing the prison. They talked about dropping their bombs. They talked about flying back across occupied France trying to evade German fighters. Their stories also matched the official narrative. The bombing happened. They did their job. Many of them made it back. Some didn't. The French resistance talked about their role in the operation. They talked about having people inside the prison. They talked about coordinating with the RAF. They talked about helping prisoners escape after the bombing. They talked about providing safe houses and escape routes. Their stories confirmed that this was a coordinated operation. This wasn't spontaneous. This was planned. But the mystery remained. Who decided to do this? What was the real motivation? Why was this operation authorized when it violated several conventions? Bombing a civilian building, even to free prisoners, was controversial. Risking RAF pilots and prisoners' lives to free people was questionable from a pure military standpoint. So why was it authorized? The answer was never fully given. Historians have been arguing about Operation Jericho for 80 years. They've written books about it. They've analyzed the records. They've interviewed survivors. They've examined official documents. They've speculated about classified documents. And they still can't agree on what really happened or why. Some say it was a brilliant tactical success. Others say it was a desperate and costly gamble that happened to pay off. Others say it was a politically motivated operation that was disguised as a rescue mission. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Operation Jericho was probably all of those things. It was a bold military operation. It was a rescue mission. It probably involved political calculations. It probably involved someone trying to prove something. It saved lives. It cost lives. It was mysterious then, and it remains mysterious now. The real story of Operation Jericho is a story of wartime chaos and moral ambiguity. It's a story of men making difficult decisions with incomplete information. It's a story of brave pilots flying dangerous missions. It's a story of prisoners risking their lives to escape. It's a story of civilians caught in the middle of a war that wasn't theirs. And it's a story that reminds us that history is more complicated than the official narratives suggest. That famous operations often have hidden motivations, that the truth is often murkier than we'd like it to be. Operation Jericho sounds like a clear-cut success story. A daring raid, prisoners freed, Nazis defeated. But the reality is far more complex, far more ambiguous, far more mysterious. Wing Commander Pickard died in the mission. He's remembered as a hero, and he was a hero. But he was also a pilot following orders that came from someone who had reasons for authorizing the mission, reasons that have never been fully explained, someone whose name might not even be in the historical record, someone who made a decision that changed the lives of 700 prisoners, that killed over 100 people, that cost the lives of 2 RAF pilots, and that has remained mysterious for 80 years. If you want to see more videos about the real stories from World War II that go beyond the propaganda, hit subscribe. New videos every week.